All right. So with new site 3, we're going to get into something using like another API to. So right now in new site 3, we've been loading our data in. We've been importing our like article data from an article like JSON file, or so that we're just like directly importing the article data. But in the future, in new site 3, we're going to actually use an outside server, so almost like a third-party API to get our article data and then serve that article data in our components in our application. But that brings, but before we do that, we're going to talk about asynchronous JavaScript and synchronous JavaScript. So I'm just going to create, I'm in Papa Challenges. I've created a directory called async sync promise. I'm going to make a directory or make a file called async sync.js. And I'm going to code async. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Let me zoom in.
Yep.
All right, there we go.
Hey, Tom.
Yep.
Real quick, I just want to make sure, since we had issues with the version 5 versus version 6 with the router yesterday, that was causing a lot of problems. Are we going to see similar type of things with today's lessons?
No, so like we'll be using the code from yesterday, so you'll still see it, and we'll talk about it, but it won't be directly related to today's lesson. Today's lesson is not regarding React Router, but we'll talk about it though. All right, let's talk about synchronous JavaScript code. Does anybody know what synchronous code is?
Code executing in order, starting from top to bottom.
Executing
Always
and
blocking.
I'm sorry?
Code that always blocks and works from the top to the bottom. It
Yep.
always goes in order.
Yeah. So when your JavaScript files run, it reads from top to bottom and it executes the code in order. So one line of code is executed. Once that's done, another line. Once that's done, another line. So it just keeps going. So if we take, let's run I'm just going to declare a variable called false. And I'm going to run a console.log started. And I'll just actually move that up here. So started. And I'm going to create a function called check variable. That's a function that just checks if A is true. If it's true, it's going to console log success. Else, if A is false, it's going to console log failed. And I'm going to invoke that function, check variable. And then down here on line 19, I'm going to reassign this variable to true. So what do you expect to happen when, I'm just going to say console log ended. So if I run this code in the terminal, what do you expect the output to be, or what do you expect to be printed out? If this is synchronous code.
False.
Yeah,
So,
failed.
So it's gonna come up when I run this file. Sorry, someone gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say output should be started, then failed, then ended.
Yep. So when I run this, it runs from top to bottom. So it comes in here, executes started, assigns a variable A to false, declares a function called check variable, executes the check variable function, reassigns the A value to a variable to true, and then console logs ended. So if it comes in here, started, runs this check variable function, check variable is checks if A is true or false. It's currently false. Console logs failed, and then at console logs ended. If I run this, started, failed, ended. So this is synchronous code. So code executing in order. And how this works is there's something we can get into it. I think we kind of covered it a couple during HTML week, but I don't know, Ankur, did we cover the event loop? I can't remember if we did.
No, I don't think we did.
Okay. Well, in JavaScript, there's something called the event loop, which stores all your functions in a queue. So this gets executed first, and then check variable gets put on top of that, and then console log gets put on top of that. So it's in a queue. And before it moves to the next line, the first item in the queue has to complete before it can move on to the next item. So that's why it's running in order. Comes up here, that gets executed first, this gets executed second, this gets executed third. So that is synchronous JavaScript code. And that's how JavaScript is typically ran, is synchronously. But there are scenarios where synchronous code occurs. And now, what is synchronous code or asynchronous code?
Code that's not run in order. Every function returns when it's finished, and it can be at different times.
Yep. So code that can be executed or returned in a different order. So if we wanted to make this code asynchronous, and I wanted to run this, I wanted to somehow run this code, this check variable function, and have it be run a success. But it's being executed right here on line 18. So there's a function in JavaScript which I can make this code asynchronous, and that is called set timeout. Some of you may have seen that before. And set timeout takes in two arguments. One is a callback function, which is going to be my check variable function. And the other input is a time of when to execute this check variable function. It's like how many seconds after the set timeout is executed should I run the check variable function. So let's say it's going to be 5 seconds. That's kind of long. And this is milliseconds. So 5,000 milliseconds equals 5 seconds. Let's say 3 seconds. So if I run this now, so again, set timeout takes in a callback function, which is going to be my check variable. And it's going to say, hey, when I get to this line of code, wait 3 seconds and then execute this check variable function. So if I run this now, what should be the output down here?
Hey, Tom, I think you need to wrap that in a anonymous function.
I think it should still work, because if this is my callback function, right? Or
Wouldn't that invoke it right away because of the?
yeah, I think you're right. All right.
And there's a chance that A will set to true, and then it'll get called afterwards. So we'll get success, right?
So
Yeah.
it'll be, let's just run it and see.
Yep.
So it started, ended, 1, 2, 3, success. So what's going on here is I'm console logging it. I'm running the set timeout function, which is it's executing the set timeout function. And then it's coming down here and saying it's reassigning the A variable to true. And then once it's set timeout, after 3 seconds occur, it's going to execute this check variable function. So after 3 seconds, it's going to run this check variable function. It's going to say, hey, is A true? It's true now. Now it's going to console log success.
So here's the question that I have for you. So I do get what set function does, right? It's setting like a timer to start the function within it. However, once we're executing the code, doesn't it still read it from top to bottom?
Yep.
So how does it actually read set timeout before the function even? Like, does it just know to look for set timeout first when it's actually like running through?
No, say that again.
So like, you know how it like synchronously would run from top to bottom, then we have set timeout to be async, correct? Which is gonna put check variable after 3 seconds, check variable function. But what I'm saying is like, isn't it still like synchronous in the sense where, sorry, I hope you can hear me, where it's like scanning down, isn't it still trying to hit check variable before the set timeout? Like, okay, I guess my question is, how come the set timeout function doesn't have to be before the check variable function? Like, how does the computer know prior?
Right.
I don't know if I'm clarifying that right.
How does the check variable function know?
No, like, I don't know. Can you still hear me? Because it's super
Yeah.
loud here.
No, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay,
So,
so
Jonathan, I think what you're looking for is like whenever you have a function, that function has to be called. So if Tom erased the if he had it as synchronous and he commented out the check variable, then nothing would be output inside of the check variable function. We'd have started and we have ended, but nothing inside of that function would be called or would be output because it wasn't being called. So what the set timeout is doing is just delaying when that function is being called.
yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly what I was missing. I'm gonna blame the chainsaws and construction outside, but thank you, Morgan.
Yeah, so the set timeout makes synchronous code asynchronous. And this is just to simulate asynchronous code pretty much.
Do websites use this as a strategy to get more engagement on advertisements? Because there's a sports blog I read almost daily, and every time I go to click on the comments, right before I click on the comments, the ads will load perfectly where the comments were, and I click on an ad. It's incredible.
Probably, I don't think they probably use a set timeout, but it definitely does use asynchronous code. So all over the web, there's asynchronous code all the time. And this is what we're going to, that's kind of like the topic of today, is how to deal with asynchronous code. So we have a set timeout. So this is makes synchronous. Am I spelling code asynchronous? And this is to simulate. You'll see when we talk about like where you'll actually see asynchronous code. So if we have asynchronous code, if we have to deal with asynchronous code in the web, what is like a scenario where you have to make sure things are completed in order or else they'll fail? So I like to think of like logging into Facebook. What happens when you log into Facebook or any portal or any application?
It recommends a friend for me who I would never be friends with in real life.
All right. Yeah. So, well, first you have to log in. So when you type, Tom Preet, type in my password, I press send, it goes to the backend server. It checks against my credentials. It says, okay, I'm successfully logged in, but now what happens? Now it routes me to my news feed. Now what does the news feed consist of? A bunch of posts. So now I have to get posts. All right, I grab a post. All right, well, posts have comments. Now I have to grab all the posts comments. All right, what else do I need to get? All right, I have to get photos. All right, now I have to go get photos. So it doesn't do all that stuff at the same time. It can't grab Tom Preet's post before Tom Preet logs in. So this is where asynchronous code, you'll see asynchronous code, but if I want to make sure that things actually operate in order when dealing with asynchronous code, such as logging in, grabbing comments or grabbing posts, then grabbing the posts comments, and then grabbing like the likes of the posts or comments. So I have to wait to log in first. Then I have to, grab all the posts. Then I have to grab all the comments. So when I'm dealing with asynchronous code, I can make asynchronous code. So let's just kind of simulate that. So if I do set timeout. That takes in a callback, and I'm going to console log, log in. So after I log in, what do I want to do? Then I want to grab console log, get posts. Then I want to, console log, get comments. Then I want to timeout. Get like console log, get photos. So, and I think that let's just be done with that. So set timeout, that takes, grabbing photos might take 2 seconds. Grabbing comments might take 1.5 seconds. Grabbing all the posts might take, 3 seconds. And logging in might take 1 second. So if I were to execute this, not Python, I'm going to run that. I started, log in. All right, now it's log in. Now I'm getting all the posts. Now I got the comments. Now I got the photos. And now like the overall logging in, it loaded everything on the page finally. So this is how you can make asynchronous code, making asynchronous code synchronous. But this is really dirty. This is like a bunch of nested callbacks. So I'm doing a set timeout within a set timeout within a set timeout within a set timeout. This is actually what is called callback hell in JavaScript. What questions do you have? Because you're going to be dealing with asynchronous code a lot using web, but you have to somehow make that asynchronous code that operates in different orders. You have to somehow make that code synchronous.
So do you know that it's going to be synchronous because you call the console.log first and then the set timeout? Or are you just assuming that the 2 seconds is going to be enough for?
Right now, I'm just like assuming that like this is what it might take just to grab everything. I'm just kind of making this stuff up with regards to like the time. It can be any time.
Okay, but you know it will be synchronous because you do the set timeout after a console log, like on line 29.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. What other questions do you have about making synchronous code or making asynchronous code? Code that's executed in different orders, synchronous, to make it actually execute in order.
Tom, what's the I guess the benefit of asynchronous code? Why is it where, so say for instance, with this example, you log in, right? And then you get posts, comments, and photos all at once. Like, why would you have to make it asynchronous? Or what's the benefit of doing that?
It's not necessarily what's the benefit. It's more of like, well, if I can't get the comments of a post until I get the posts. So if I click on a post ID, I can't grab the comments to that post until I grab the actual post first. And then I grab that post and then I can do something else. This is just like a simulation of if comments relied on the post getting to the user first, and then I can grab the comments of that post. And then maybe the photos relied on the comments for whatever reason. I can do that. But it also has to go with like single threaded. It's like, so this isn't like JavaScript is like a single threaded language where only one operation can occur at a time. Now that isn't 100% true, but only one piece of code or one part of the CPU, one thread can operate or execute one single thing of code at a time. That's where like this, where it's like once I log in, now I can move on to the next task, which is get the posts. I can't run them simultaneously because I'm only working on like a single thread. Now that's technically not 100% true, but that's kind of where you want to execute one piece of code at a time. It's kind of like what that's simulating.
Actually, a quick question. I guess is the reason that there's, I could be wrong, but is the reason that there, to my knowledge, there isn't an equivalent of set timeout in Python because you would use threading to do the same thing?
I don't know 100%, but I mean, that sounds like correct. Because yeah, like a lot of the other language, you can run things in parallel on different threads.
This using the set timeout here seems to be just an example. Like, is there a way that we can actually trigger off of like a complete this function instead of just like some random timer that we can basically set it up so we don't have to know exactly how long it takes? Are we gonna be exploring that, or are we just basically introducing this concept and we'll have to learn it later on?
I'm glad you brought that up. Because there is something that, well, before I move on, does anybody else have any questions about like synchronous code and asynchronous code? So again, we're going to be dealing with asynchronous code in web applications, and we're going to need to make that asynchronous code act like it's synchronous. All right. So I'm going to make another file called promise.js, and I'm going to code that promise.js. All right. So, so let's actually like think about the word promise. Like, I'm like, if I decide to, you know, it's Tuesday and we just moved into a house and I have to hang a bunch of stuff on walls. And, you know, I promised my wife that, hey, I promise by Friday, I'm going to hang this, you know, wine rack or whatever it might be. So I'm going to promise I'm going to hang this wine rack by Friday. So it's Tuesday now. If tomorrow I check, what's the status of this promise? Is it completed? Did I fail at that promise, or is it pending? Just ran. Anybody?
Pending.
Is it pending, Seth?
Yeah, because you said by Friday. It's not Friday yet.
Yep.
So it's pending.
And by Friday, so between now, so I execute this, I said, hey, today I'm going to execute this promise. By Friday, it's going to be like, this is when I'm planning on completing it. So I executed this promise today, and it's continuing to execute from Tuesday to Friday. And during that time, my promise is pending. And then once Friday occurs, either I, you know, hang the wine rack or I don't hang the wine rack. So if I do, I completed and I resolve that promise. It's a successful promise. If I don't, that means I failed at that promise and the promise was rejected. Just think of those: resolve, rejected, or success or failure. So in JavaScript, there is a object called a promise. And promise is a promise object is the representation of an eventual completion or failure of some task, some code. It's either going to complete or it's going to fail at some point in the future, but it doesn't know when it's going to be completed. It just knows that, hey, there's going to be some code that's being returned at some point in the future, and I don't know when that is going to actually occur. So when dealing with asynchronous operations, so just like with this set timeout, we have a specific time where we explicitly say like, hey, when this code is going to be executed, like in 3 seconds and 1 second in 15 seconds or whatever. A promise doesn't know when that code is complete. So a promise lets asynchronous methods return values like synchronous methods or code. So again, a promise, let's just say I'm just gonna write promise represents the eventual completion or failure of asynchronous code. And it will always return a value regardless if it fails or not. It'll return some value, but we determine what that value is. So again, a JavaScript promise represents that the completion or failure of some asynchronous code at some point in the future. Some point in the Any questions about that kind of concept?
Do you set the time in the future, like a deadline? Or-
Nope. So, for example, like if I log in and it's taking forever, that promise will never get resolved and it'll never go on to the next task. It'll just wait, or it'll time out. Like the server will time out and it'll probably eventually return something. If like the server decides like, hey, you've been doing this operation for too long, I'm going to actually just kill it and return something. But let's actually kind of write a promise. So I'm going to create a function called myPromise. And the promise, again, this is a JavaScript object. In order to instantiate a new instance of this object, I need to write new promise. And this promise takes in a callback function, a single element, which is a callback function. And I can write a callback function, just an anonymous callback function like so. And what this callback function takes in as an argument, it takes in two arguments. It takes in what function to execute when I resolve it. So when it completes. So if the promise is successful, that's what the resolve is, or it's going to get rejected. Means this is when if the promise fails. All right. So let's just kind of execute this. Let's just simulate when I execute this promise. Let's just say it's going to take 10 seconds, or no, that's too long. That's 5 seconds. So I'm just going to do a set timeout just to simulate how long it's going to take to resolve this promise or reject this promise. So let's actually just do 3 seconds. I'm going to say, I'm going to create a random number. Math.random, which takes in a number between 0 and 0.99. So I'm going to say, hey, if random number is greater than or equal to 0.25, I'm going to console log, data received, and I'm going to resolve this promise. The promise is going to be over. So I'm going to resolve. I'm going to say, here is some data. And this resolve function can take in any data type. You can type in you can have a string, you can pass in an object, you can do whatever you want. Pass in any data you want. Else, if the random number is not greater than or equal to 0.25, I'm going to reject the promise. I'm going to just say like 500 internal server error. And down here at the very bottom, all right. So again, this promise object represents the eventual completion of some asynchronous code. And this promise takes in an anonymous function that takes in, the anonymous function takes in 2 arguments, a function that takes it that to execute when the promise is successfully completed, or a function that to call when if it fails. So I'm gonna call it resolve reject. And I'm gonna execute that resolve function if the promise is successful. And if it's not successful, I'm gonna reject it. On line 5, I'm literally just creating a random number to like randomly resolve or reject this promise. So essentially 75% of the time, the promise should be resolved successfully or completed successfully. 25% of the time, the promise should be failed and rejected. What questions do you have about that?
I have a couple questions, Tom.
Yep.
So what exactly is the benefit for this over the nested callbacks?
So like this part?
Yeah.
Because this is called, does this look kind of pretty?
No, it does not.
Yeah. So I'm just going to kind of show you what callback hell looked like back. Where would it go? So back in the day, before we had these tools like promises, if this looked bad, this is what it actually looked like. And this is jQuery and Ajax. This is a way we can make requests to like a backend endpoint. So this is what callback hell kind of looked like. It's really nasty looking. And all of this, we're going to kind of show you what took place of this in a second. So, but I'll also just show you kind of what this looks like. Go ahead.
Okay, so that makes sense. And also I want to ask, what's the use of that new keyword right there on line 4?
So when instantiating a new object, just like in Python, we would just like write the object name. In JavaScript, and to create a new instance of a promise, we have to do the new keyword to create a new instance of an object.
For the resolve reject, those are like specific functions that are they're almost just like special return statements, right? Could we put any type of function in there, or does it have to be resolve and reject?
So we can say like success, but or failure, but these two, the first argument is the successful function, and the second function is the rejection function. So you have to have either or both of these.
And when you say function, can those be like fat arrows? Because right now you're just placing in there a string or a value to be returned, but could we make those into actual like do something like functions that take and do like some math or something? Or,
resolve and reject?
Yeah.
No, they have to return.
They're just basically fancy return statements.
Yeah, you can think of it like that. But okay, you're going to see how this works, and this is where it kind of comes in new.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm going to execute this promise. Let's see if I actually am able to get it. So I declare this promise, and now I'm going to execute it. Uh-oh, my promise is not a function. So it says waiting data. I haven't seen that before. Or can I just execute it like so? Yeah, there we go. So to execute this, I just did my promise. I didn't invoke it or anything. So let's clear that again. Let's run that again. Waiting for data. Uh-oh, it said waiting for data, unhandled promise rejection warning, 500 internal server error. So this time the promise was rejected. So if I run that again, so maybe I'll get a completed one, waiting 3 seconds. It rejected again. Let's see if I can get it to actually succeed. Data received, great.
Hey, Tom, on this, if you take away line 17 and just run the file, why does it run?
Good, because this is essentially creating a new instance, and this is kind of like running right away. So you don't have to actually invoke it. Did you say when I get rid of line 17?
Yeah, if you don't call it, it automatically just calls no matter what, at least on my
Oh,
VS Code.
yeah. I think it's just because the new promise, because I'm in, is it because I'm invoking it here? Yeah. That makes sense. Because I'm passing in that anonymous function and it's just running. All right. So notice this promise, when I'm executing it, let me actually see if do I even need this then? But yeah. So I created this new promise that's running. And when it gets to this resolve, here are some data. It's just saying waiting for data and data received. So it's coming down here. It's waiting for data. It waits 1 second, comes up here if it says data received. And now this resolve function is executed. But where is this going? And where is this rejection going? Let's see if we can get it to reject. Let's just throw 0.01 just to get it to reject right away. It says unhandled promise rejection warning. The error originated either by throwing inside of an async function without a catch block. So promises can be chained together. So when I do my promise dot then, so this is where it's like, all right, when I execute this promise, this asynchronous block of code, after it completes, then what do I want to do? And so this is where that callback hell, we're doing set timeout and then running this get post, then running get comments, then running get photos. We can do the same thing in here by doing the dot then. So once this promise completes successfully, what do I want to do by running the dot then on it? And this dot then takes in another anonymous function. And the resolve, the response from the successful completion of this promise gets passed in to this anonymous functions as an argument. So I can console log the response of, I'll just actually do response. So my promise, once it's resolved successfully, I'm going to pass in the response, which is this resolve, into the anonymous function in the dot then function. So if I wanted to make this to resolve successfully, waiting for data, data received, here is some data. So if I want to do something with this data here, here are some data. What if this was like a name, Tom? If I wanted to do something with that data, I can do it in the .then statement. Waiting for some data, data received, and now I'm just displaying this data. But when it was failing, let's make it fail again. I'm not doing anything. I'm getting an unhandled promise rejection. So in the syntax of promises kind of looks like this, the .then. But in order to handle the rejection, at the very end of my promise, I can do a catch, a .catch method, with again, takes in an anonymous function that takes in the error, which is whatever's being passed in when I'm rejecting it. And now I can console log, I can console error, the error message. So instead of running it displaying all this crap, it just displays the error. So what's happening there? It's coming into here. Is this true? Nope. Reject it. All right. All my errors, if the promise fails, runs into this catch block. Questions?
So is it sort of like an if else, except that if is usually a success and else is usually a failure of some kind?
I don't want to think of it as if else because, I don't know. If you want to think of the .then as like, if this is true, run the then statement. If it fails or whatever, goes into the catch. I'm just trying to think of like trying to correlate it with an if else statement. But I don't know if that was helpful. I don't know. But again, up here, I can get rid of all this, even like the set timeout, just.
And then also, Tom, what's the difference between console.log and console.error?
It's just a different console. I actually don't know what the actual difference is, but there's a bunch of different. If you look at the console method, there's a bunch of different. There's console.table, console.log, console.error. There's a bunch of them. But you can also just use console.log. So this is how you make asynchronous code act synchronously. So I'm promising to complete something in the future. If I complete that promise, I'm going to resolve it. I'm going to pass in, I'm going to return that resolved data, whatever the error or whatever data I complete or whatever data I receive back from the promise, I can pass into here as the resolve. And I can pass that data into this anonymous function in the .then, and then I can do something with that data. And what's great about promises is that you can just keep chaining the .then together. So right here, I've got, let's actually just, so I've got this Tom that I'm returning from this resolve I'm passing in here. And I can console log, like do something with the data. Like maybe I want to return the response and add like age to it. or maybe age equals, 30. And now I'm going to return the response again. So let's just like console log the response. Internal server error. Oh, come on. So data received, that's the response from the promise. Now I'm doing something with that data, which I'm adding an age key to it right there. So I'm console logging it with that. Now I can do like a dot then and take in that response and console log so I'm console log in the second dot then. Come on. So I can keep chaining the dot thens together. And whatever I'm returning from this anonymous function, and I do a dot then, I can pass this response into the next dot then as an argument, like I'm doing here. And I can keep chaining that together. All right. So let's actually create a couple of functions that simulate this set timeout, login, get post, get comments, get photos, but make them as promises. So I'm going to do a login is a function. And I'm going to return a new promise. And that new promise is going to take in a resolve and reject method. I'm just going to say like let result equals true. And this is going to like simulate a success or rejection of the promise. So I'm going to say like set timeout. Again, this is just to simulate the eventual completion of a promise. Being in. So I'm logging in. I'm going to say if result is true, I'm going to resolve the promise. I'm going to say like name. So I'm going to get some data back from the server, maybe name, and maybe a message dictionary that just says success. Else, I'm going to reject the promise with a message that says like failed. So I can do that. So once I log in, maybe I also want to get some posts. So again, I'm going to console log the response in this get posts. Instead of logging in, I'm going to be getting posts. And then once I resolve, I'm going to, instead of displaying the name, I'm going to display some posts. Oop. So posts with an array of post 1, post 2, post 3. Get posts failed. So if I get posts, now I can get comments. Very similar. Just getting comments. And then the last one, let's just say like getting photos. Whoop. I think this is actually okay. And now you have to add some time to that. 1.5 seconds. 1 second. 2 seconds. So if I log in, let's see if this works. So I actually, because that's a function, log in. Let me clear. So if I run that, oh, data received, oh, it actually executed this. All right. So right now I'm logging in, but once I log in, what do I want to do next? I can do, go ahead.
I was gonna say, if it's successful, then you want to get the comments.
Yep. So I want to take in that response. I can do something with that response if I want to, but I don't always have to. That's actually get posts. I'm just going to pass in that response. Actually, that's actually not. So the get posts, get comments, I'm not going to do anything with that. So it takes in an anonymous function. The console log the response. And so dot then. So let's actually run that. Python, not Python. Logging in, I got my response, which I'm displaying console logging right here. And now I'm getting the posts. So now it's getting the posts. Now I can do a dot then off of that and get the response from that and console log the response from that res, and now I can get comments. So if I clear that, log in, uh-oh, why does it say undefined?
Do you have to return something in the first? I feel like I remember seeing that on one of the above examples where you were returning something in the first dot then statement.
Where my posts? So getting posts.
Yeah, I think Morgan's got it. You should have to return the get posts and return to get comments, so that you're returning the promises that were returned from those.
Yep. Let's see. Log in, getting posts, got the post, and then getting comments. And the getting comments resolved to that. So I'm actually resolving and I'm getting the comments. I'm just not just displaying anything with them. And then at the very end, if there's any errors, I can run a catch. Error. Console log error. I can run an error. So for getting posts, maybe posts failed. So the result is false. So it's going to fail. So logging in, getting post message, get posts failed. Questions about promises. Again, promise is the eventual completion of an asynchronous block of code. And then I can do something with that.
Tom, this is Mike. I'm just I'm trying to like wrap my head around this. I'm assuming like the use case here is that we don't know how long certain tasks will take.
Yep.
And so we're just trying to like manage that. For example, if we make a call to a server and we're waiting for the response to get the authentication back for a user, we can't, like, the next piece of code forwards them to the logon page or their home page, but we can't do that until we know that, hey, and we don't know how long that could be. Maybe they're like, it's Black Friday morning and there's a ton of internet traffic and the server response takes a long time. So, but I guess where I'm a little confused is like, if we were doing it synchronously, wouldn't that function that goes out to get that information just be waiting there anyway to complete? And that's where I'm a little confused, I guess, but I don't know if that makes sense, but I don't know, still trying to wrap my mind around it. I think probably as we do some more examples, it'll be more clear, but just trying to understand why we couldn't just do it synchronously, sort of, but.
Because we might want to do something with that code. So maybe we've got some data back and we want to manipulate that data. But if you can't move on and manipulate that data until it actually gets back. So if I try to manipulate some data before it gets back from the server, it's going to throw an error. So we have to wait for that data to get back and then move on to the next thing, do something with that data, and then do something else with that data.
Yeah. And I guess where I'm confused is like, let's say we had a function that said like, do complicated stuff. And it was like going through some loop and it was just like churning through some data. And we had that function, we call that function. And then the next line of code like does something with that function. Like that next line of code isn't going to execute until that until that function call we made finishes, right? And so that's why I'm trying to understand, like, if that function before it, like, do complicated stuff, it's churning. Like the code isn't going to move to the next step until that function returns. Like I'm thinking of like, if I was just writing like a program in Python or a program in JavaScript, like
it's because it's not synchronous. This is all dealing with asynchronous code. So like getting data from something else, like you're going to see it when we use the fetch API. It's an asynchronous piece of code. And that's what we have to use. So we need to make that asynchronous code act synchronously.
Gotcha. All right. That makes sense. I appreciate it, Tom.
Yep. So right here, we're doing the .then. There's all right, execute this piece of code, then execute this piece of code, then execute A, B, C in this order. But there's another way we can do this. Same thing, but a little more syntactically friendly. So if I want to do the same thing, I'm going to create like a login Facebook function. And I'm going to say, hey, make sure this code acts synchronously. This asynchronous piece of code acts synchronous. So I've got this arrow function, and before the open brackets, or the parentheses, I'm going to say, hey, this is an asynchronous piece of code, but I want to make sure that this piece of code acts synchronously. So right here, let's see. Yeah. So when I log in, so if I say login data, I'm going to await the login promise up here, this login function. And what this is saying is it's saying, hey, before you move on to down here, whatever's code's going to be down here, wait until this is done executing this, because this is asynchronous code. So let post data equals await get posts, then let comment data equals await get comments. So this is saying, hey, before you move on to post data, wait for the login data to get back. So if I can print or console log, login data, can print post data, or I can console log comment data. So if I execute this, I should get, oh, what happened? I need to actually execute it. So log in Facebook. Let's just make sure it all resolves to true. Logging in, getting post data, getting comments. So async await does the same thing as this dot then catch, but it's a little more easier to read. It's literally only like 3 lines of code. So for example, if like the get post function relied on the login data to come back for whatever reason, like let's just say that get post takes in the login data and does something with it. This is saying like, hey, make sure the login data comes back before I try to execute the get post function. Otherwise, it'll blow up. So if I didn't have that, and let's go into get post just to see, takes in some response or some data. Console log. So if I didn't have that async, see if it actually, see how it's all out of order. This is where like a pending promise, that's like the promise hasn't resolved yet. And this pending promise, if I'm not mistaken, is being console logged right here in the login function. It's passing that promise in here, but it hasn't been 2 seconds yet. So the promise was pending. And then it finally resolved by saying logging in. But you see how it's all out of order. It's getting posts, then it's getting comments. So that's why we want to make it asynchronous, or not. We want to make sure that this asynchronous code awaits the login to be done, then the comments, or the get the login, posts, and comments. So now logging in works, getting posts, then getting the comments. Questions on this?
Can you drop this in Slack just so we can kind of play around with it?
Yeah. So before we go on break, I'm going to do something real quick. I'm going to create a touch index.html and an app.js, and I'm going to code app.js and index.html. And I'm going to split the screen. And I'm going to do HTML. Oh, no, not that. Just going to create a button that displays some data. It's going to load app.js. And so this body is going to take in, it's going to have a button that says get data. It's going to have a div, an empty div initially. with an ID of message. And it's going to have an unordered list with a list item. All right. So this button. So in my app.js, what I'm going to do is let button. I'm going to click this button to get data, and it's going to go dispatch out to some API and grab some data and then display it on the screen. So I'm going to say document dot get element by tag name. The tag is going to be a button. It's going to be the first button on the page. And on the button, I'm going to add an on click. Just on click, and this is going to return get data function, which I have to write. Whoop. God dang it. All right. I'm going to let item. I'm just going to copy this over. I'm going to grab the item by its ID, and I'm going to grab the message. So I'm grabbing the item by its ID, and I'm grabbing the message by its ID. And now this get data function is going to use what is called the fetch API. So back kind of when I showed you that Ajax, where'd it go? Actually, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. All right, so I created a little HTML file that has a button that says get message. I have a div with a message. I'll just say it like message here. And I have a list, an empty list item. So if I look at my page, I've got a button that says get data, and here's going to be my message. So if I refresh it, message here. What I want is to use something to go out to an API. So it could be a third-party API. It can be my Django backend as an API URL to retrieve some data. Now I want to display that data on my HTML file or my HTML page. Luckily, there's some JSON placeholder type code or whatever it is. JSON placeholder that has able to make fake get requests or real get requests just to serve up some dummy data. And I'm going to use this API endpoint right here. So JSON placeholder like this right here, to-dos. And this is what I'm going to get back. This JSON right here. This is the JSON response. So back to our code. Inside of this get data, the old ways of JavaScript, we would have to do these Ajax requests that has an HTTP. I go to, that JSON placeholder, I get a response, but Ajax is like the old way of doing things. Now JavaScript has a function called fetch. And fetch takes in two optional arguments, or one mandatory argument and one optional. We're going to just deal with the first argument right now. We'll deal with the second optional argument in a later news site. But the first argument is the API endpoint that you want to go to. And this fetch method, this fetch function, returns a JavaScript promise. That's why we're kind of talking about promises earlier. So if you remember from this promise, if it returns, just like this login, or it returns a JavaScript promise, this fetch also returns a JavaScript promise. So I'm just going to do console log fetching data. So down here, I can do it .then. So if this fetch returns a promise, I can do .then, and I can grab the response. And I'm going to console log the response like so. And at the very end of that catch block, at the very end, I'm going to add this catch block just there. I'm just going to do console log just to keep things simple. So let's just look at what that looks like. So if I come back to my HTML page, now if I refresh it, and I click get data, notice how I get this response. So this fetch returns a promise that resolves, not rejects, it always resolves to the response of the HTTP request. So this fetch just resolved to the response of this HTTP request. So that's why it's being console logged to this response. But I want to extract this response. I want to extract the data off of this response. And I can do that by let data equals, actually, I'm just going to return. I'm going to take this response, and I'm going to execute the .json method onto it to extract the data from the response. And then I'm going to grab that data that's returned from that response, and I'm going to console log returning data from response. I can console log that data. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to refresh that. I'm going to click that get message. So I'm fetching the data. I get the response back. The fetch API resolves to the response of the HTTP request. Then I take that response, I run, so returning data from the response. So I run that response.json to convert that data to something I can use in JavaScript. And now you can kind of see the data that's being returned from that response. And then in here, I can run I can say message. I'm just going to do .inner HTML equals loading. Console log received response. Now parsing response data. And then in here, it said returning console log the data. I'm going to do message .inner HTML equals complete. And then for the item, I'm going to say return item inner HTML equals data title, because I want to display that data. I want to display the title right here. So I want to extract the title from the response and display it right here. So I'm going to refresh that and watch this message here. This is the message that's going to load and indicate that it's complete. See how it did loading and then complete, and then it displayed it here. So if fetching data, I got that response object, the response received. Now I'm parsing the response data, and now I'm actually returning the response to the front end right here. So here's display loading message. And then this is the display complete message. And then here, I'm actually adding the inner HTML, the title to the inner HTML. So if I refresh it again, message here, it happened so fast that it didn't even like load. Questions, what questions do you have about the fetch API?
Is the fetch API it's a JavaScript thing, not a React thing? And it also for promises, is promises a JavaScript thing and not like a React thing?
Correct.
Thank you.
JavaScript, it's all JavaScript. It's not specific to React.
So fetch will work with, browser JavaScript and Node.js.
Browser, yes.
Yesterday, I was looking at Bootstrap and they had some components called spinners. I'm wondering that, is this where you would use a spinner in order to indicate that like, hey, this is still like requesting the fetch?
Exactly. Except it'd be all done in React instead of just vanilla JavaScript. All right. So that's just like an introduction to the fetch API, which we'll see in today's new site. What other questions do you have?
Yeah, one more. I mean, I guess it's kind of off topic. It's Axios. I mean, I've used that before. I don't really remember much about it. But is that using the fetch API? Is that just another library built on top of fetch API?
I don't know what Axios is actually using. I think it might be using HTTP request object. I might be. I actually don't know.
Okay.
But yeah, if you've heard of Axios, Axios is just another way to make API requests or HTTP requests, except it's an external library that you actually have to install. Right. Any other questions? All right.